So, when we start looking at this next one, I'm just going to make these up. And we're going to say that if parent number 1 is heterozygous, and we cross a heterozygous with another heterozygous, what would we get? So this is just meaning cross. If they were to sexually reproduce, what would we get for them? So important things here is our prefix hetero and our prefix hetero tell us the combinations. Now, our two prefixes that we've been dealing with are homo and hetero, and the prefix hetero means same or different. Hetero means different. So if we're using the letter T's, we have two different letters, like capital versus lowercase. We have a big T, little t for this one, and the second parent is heterozygous, so hetero means same or different. So that's going to be a big T, little t. So parent number 1, we kind of told you should go on the top, but it really doesn't matter. They could go on the side. Parent number 2 goes on the side, but it really doesn't matter. It could go on the top. The idea is one goes one place, the other parent goes the other place. Now during meiosis, parent number 1 could pass on a big T or a little t. Parent number 2 could pass on a big T or a little t. And depending upon, if parent number 1 passed on a big T and parent number 2 passed on a big T, then that's the box, that would be the outcome. If parent number If parent number 1 passes on the little t, but parent number 2 passes on the big T, then that is the box that we would see. Or like that, or like that. That's the idea of these Punnett squares. If there's a capital letter that should be written in the box, for example, we have a little t and a big T, we write the big T first. Just like down here, we have a little t and a big T when we drag and drop, but we always write the capital letter. So we get a Punnett square that looks like this. The genotype is the genetic makeup, is how the letter combinations that we see. So I go through all the boxes and I look for all the different genetic makeups or all the different letter combinations we get, or that there are, and there's a big T, there's a big T, little t, and there's a little t, little t. Those are the 3 different genetic combinations that can be produced based upon these 2 parents. Those are all the possible outcomes. Then I simply go through, and out of these 4 boxes, how many are big T, big T? Well, there's 1 out of 4. So I often write it as a fraction. You could do a percent, it'd be 25%, that'd be fine too. And then we say, well, big T, little t, there's another big T, little t, so that's 2 out of 4, or we can reduce that fraction. You don't have to if you don't want to. You can say 2 out of 4. Or you can say 50%. I'm going to say 1/2. And then little t is going to be a 1 out of 4 probability. Now, if these 2 pea plants sexually reproduce, and the first seed grows up, we plant that seed, and it grows up to be a little t, it's going to be short. Can I plant another seed and still get a second seed and have it be little t? Yeah. Could I plant a third seed and it still be little t? Can I plant a 4th seed and it still be little t? Yeah. Each time I flip a coin is a random event. So each time they have produced a seed, in this case, there's a 1 out of 4 probability that they're going to be little t. These are possible outcomes. It's a prediction of outcomes, not a guaranteed results. So if I were to plant 4 seeds, statistically, I'd have 3 tall, 1 little t out of 4. But it is possible that all 4 of those 4 could be. It's possible, but it's not super probable. That'd be like flipping heads 4 times in a row. Is it possible? Sure. Is it super likely? No. Not very probable. but it's possible. Okay? So genotype are the letters. When we talk about phenotype, phenotype is how they physically look. Phenotype is how they physically look. So I keep saying it like that because hopefully that'll help. If we look at this box, big T, and remember big T represents tall and little t represents short. How is big T physically going to look, tall or short? Tall. Okay, so this one, you don't have to write it in the box. I'm just going to do it for today, for this one. So that one's going to be tall. Big T, little t, what are we going to see? We're going to see the tall trait, because tall is dominant over short. And given the choice that, or given the circumstance where you have both traits, the dominant trait dominates. I feel like you gotta say it like that. It dominates over the recessive trait. So the tall is gonna dominate over the recessive. Big T, little t, tall or short? Tall. And little t, that's gonna be our short. So when we go through, what do they physically look like? My two choices were tall or short. Those are how they physically look. And 3 out of the 4 are tall, and 1 out of the 4 would be short. It's a predicted outcome, again, not guaranteed results. Questions on that? All right, then I want you to find a different sheet. The next sheet is the sheet that we got, I don't remember what page, I think that was yesterday. It says, Punnett Square practice questions. We wrote the 6 definitions yesterday. Again, if you don't have one, it's the second sheet down, I believe is what it is. Okay, I want you to find it. I got this one yesterday. You should have these ones go in. Now, the intent of how we formatted this was we were going to cut it in half, and we were going to give you the top half. So then it was going to be front versus back, and then the bottom was going to be a different half sheet. Okay, so we're going to do a lot of flipping here, but we went through, and yesterday you should have written down these definitions. If not, you'll be asked to write them again at some point. So on the back, we're going to kind of use those vocab, and we're going to use those definitions, and we're going to give some examples. So the instructions say, using the alleles listed below, give an example of each vocab word listed. So we're going to say that big G represents green pea pods, and little g represents yellow pea pods. Okay, big G is green pea pods, little g is yellow pea pods. So using those, and then our definition of a genotype, give an example or examples using the big G's and little g's accordingly. So if I'm asking you using big G, little g's, green pea pods, and yellow pea pods, give me an example of a possible genotype. What would be a possible genotype? Big or little? Big G. Big G, is that what you?
Oh yeah, big G.
Okay, big G, big G. Okay, and we do need to clarify whether it's bigs or littles, or I say big versus little instead of upper and lower, but it's the same idea. So big G is an example of a genotype. Are there any other possible genotypes that we could come up with?
Big G, little g.
Big G, little g, and last is
Little g,
little g. Those are the 3 different letter combinations that we could come up with big G's and little g's. One came from your mom, one came from your dad. Or I guess you're not a peep land, but one came from their mom and one came from their dad. The letters are the genetic makeup. There's 2 alleles when we write genotypes. The phenotype is how a plant physically looks, or actually appears, right? So the phenotype is what it physically looks like. So what could our pea plants physically look like? Green or yellow, okay? So our choices here of phenotypes, we could have a green, we could say green pea pod. Oops, that's supposed to be a pea pod, I can't write today. Or we could go yellow pea pod. And I'm just gonna get lazy and go dot, dot, dot. Using big G for green pea pod, little g for yellow pea pod, what is a dominant allele? Yeah, that isn't how I was thinking about it, but yeah, green pea pod would be the dominant allele pod. And what would be the letter that we would represent that dominant allele with?
Big G.
Yeah, big G. In my mind, I was thinking big G for the dominant allele, but absolutely the dominant allele, the trait that we see is the green pea pod. So what's the recessive allele then? Yellow pea pod, which we can represent with a lowercase g. When do we see a recessive trait? When there's a lack of, when there's the lack of a dominant. If the dominant trait and the recessive trait is there, the dominant dominates over the recessive. Okay. Heterozygous. Hetero means same or different?
Different.
So what would that look like then?
Big G, little G.
Yeah, that'd be big G, little g. Now the question isn't asking this, but what color would that be? It'd be green, because the green dominates over the yellow. Homozygous recessive. Homo means same, and recessive is bigs or littles.
Little.
So it's going to be little g, because those are the same. Right? Different. Same. For homozygous dominant, and dominant is big, so that'd be big G, big G. What are all the possible genotypes for yellow pea pod? Little g, little g. Are there any others?
No.
Nope, it's the recessive allele. The only time we see the recessive trait is when there are no dominant traits, so it has to be homozygous recessive or little g, little g. If it was green, then it'd be
Big G, and big G, little G.
yeah, big G, or big G, little g. Both of those will give us a green pea plant. If I'm a pea farmer and I look at my peas and they are green, do I know which one they are? Do I know whether it's big G, or big G, little g just by looking at it? No, I don't. If it's green, and that's the only thing I know is it's green, it's one of these two. I don't necessarily know just by looking at that one pea plant what it is. Now, if I look at some family lineages, I can maybe figure it out. Or if I look at like the next couple generations, I could maybe figure it out. But just physically looking at that pea plant, I don't know if it's big G, or big G, little g. I know there's at least one big G. I just don't know if there's one or two. If I see a yellow pea pod, do I know that's a little g though? What are all the possible genotypes for a yellow pea pod? Little g, right? So if I see a yellow pea pod, do I know the genotype? Yes, I know the genotype has to be little g, because that's the only combination that we can get to see yellow. Okay. So this is using kind of the vocab to apply it, kind of go back and forth. Questions about that before we go through a Punnett square or two together? All right, again, the intent was to kind of have two half sheets, so now we're going to flip it back to the front. And the front has question number 3 on it. So if we take a look at this, it says dimples are dominant. Are a dominant trait. Dimples are a dominant trait. A man who is heterozygous for dimples has a child with a woman who is with no dimples. Is it possible for for them to have a child who is homozygous for dimples? Explain with a Punnett square of genetic genotype and phenotype. Great. Okay, so do I tell you what letters we should use for dimples? Like I said, big G and little g. But do I tell you that for dimples? No, I don't. So you can really choose any letter you want. I'll use D just because D for dimples, right? Dimples are a dominant trait. So the dominant trait would be a capital D, or a recessive trait would be little d. So they tell us what the traits of mom and dad. Mom is heterozygous. Mom has no dimples. So let's start with dad. And it doesn't matter which location we put dad here versus mom. And it doesn't matter where we put mom versus dad here. Just so we're clear on that. So it says a man who is heterozygous for dimples. And again, I'm going to use D for dimples. If dad, I'm just going to say dad. If dad is heterozygous, what's dad's genotype have to be?
Big D, little d.
Big D, little d, right? Because hetero means different, and those are different uppercase versus lowercase. Mom has no dimples. No dimples. So is dimples the dominant or recessive trait? Recessive. And what must the genotype be if we see the recessive trait? It has to be little d, little d. The only way we see the recessive trait is if it's homozygous recessive. Just like over here when we were looking at yellow pea pods, the only way we see the recessive alleles are when it's homozygous recessive. So there are mom and dad's genotypes. It doesn't matter where you put mom and dad's alleles. I put dad on the top, I put mom on the side, it doesn't matter. Then we drag and drop, and if there's a capital letter, we put that capital letter first, so we drag and drop. We drag and drop. We always put the capital letter first. We drag and drop. Right, so that's our Punnett square. Our genotype, are those the letters or how it physically looks?
Letters.
So what are all the possible letter combinations we can get?
Big D, little d, and little d, little d.
Those are the only two choices that we have for possible children. What if a child was big D, big D? Then one of the parents isn't the parent, right? It's not genetically possible to have, with these two parents, to have a big D, big D. It's not possible. Just for the record. Okay? So, of the big D, big D, big D, little d, little d, little d, we count up out of the 4 boxes how many of them are big D, little d, and it's 2 out of 4 or 1/2. And how many are little d, little d? Again, it's 2 out of 4 or it's 1/2. How's this child going to look? Dimples or no dimples? What about this one? What about this one? What about this one? Okay, so our two phenotypes are how they physically look, are dimples or no dimples. Those are the two possible outcomes that they can physically have. And this is going to be dimples, dimples, so that's 1/2 or 2 out of the 4, or you could say 50% if you wanted to, perfectly fine. And no dimples is 1/2, or 50%, or 2 out of 4. No dimples. Questions about these? So, is it possible for them to have a child who is homozygous for dimples? So go back to this. I kind of already said this. Homozygous for dimples. Dimples is the capital letter or lowercase letter. Capital. So homozygous means same or different. So is it possible for them to have a child that's homozygous for dimples? No. It's not possible for them to have a big D, based upon their genotypes. Okay. Why don't you try this one? Dimples are a dominant trait, same as the last time. A man who has dimples has a child with a woman with no dimples. If the child doesn't have dimples, what must the genotype of dad have been? Support your answer with a Punnett square. I'd start with this. What must the genotype of child be? Then what's the genotype of mom and dad? Do a Punnett square to then kind of check that one. It's kind of a work backwards kind of thing. So why don't you give that a quick try? Child does not have dimples. Child does not have dimples. So what must the genotype of the child be then? No dimples, dominant or recessive. Recessive, and what's the only way we can see recessive trait is if the child was what's that? Homozygous, recessive. So the child does not have dimples. The child would have to be big D, little d. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. The child would have to be little d, little d. No dimples, that's a recessive trait. They must be homozygous recessive. So, if the man has dimples and the mom does not have dimples, let's say dad versus mom. If dad has dimples, what must one of his letters be? It has to be at least one big D. We don't necessarily, right now, know what the second letter is. You probably know it, but let's just start with, it has to be at least one big D. What does mom's genotype have to be? Little d, because no dimples is recessive. Mom must be little d. Right, so mom's going to be little d. That means mom only has the little d trait passed on. Dad is big D something. Okay, so given that information, this is what my Punnett square would look like so far. Is this the kid we're talking about right here? No, because does this have dimples or no dimples? It has dimples. What about this one? The way I drew mine, does this kid have dimples or no dimples? This kid has dimples. So if this box or this box is going to be a no dimples kid, where does that second little d have to come from? It has to come from dad. Dad's second letter has to be a little d. Dad's second letter has to be, he has to be heterozygous. You get two alleles, you get one from mom, one from dad. Mom only had little d's. Dad has to have, in order for a child to have two little d's, one has to come from each. So, in order for us to determine that, we can do that. Sometimes they refer to that as a test cross. It's not really what we do with humans, but if we had like a plant in question, like, oh, are they heterozygous for the trait, or are they homozygous recessive? I'm sorry, are they heterozygous or homozygous dominant? I don't know, but I want to make sure I know for that next generation. You can cross it with a homozygous recessive, because if any of the offspring come up with a recessive trait, then we know they had been heterozygous. Whereas if we only ever got the dominant trait, then all, like if this was big D, all of the children would have had dimples. So you can do that with plants. We don't do that with humans. It's not very ethical just to have children just to see what the genotypes are of a previous generation. Okay. Questions I can answer about those? All right. So this, what do we got? 57. All right. So we have. There's this packet that I'm passing out. We're going to go through just a few of these, and then you're going to work through some. This is going to be homework. You will have some time to work on it today in class, but potentially not enough to finish it. We'll see. Tomorrow we may or may not have time to finish it, to work on it. What I'm going to ask, we're going to go through a few together. I think in Canvas right now it says it's due tonight at 11:59. I'm going to change it to it's due tomorrow at 11:59. What I do want you to have done at the beginning of class tomorrow is pages 1 and 2. At a minimum, I want you to have pages 1 and 2 done for tomorrow. You may or may not have some class time to work on it tomorrow. If you do, great. You have a little bit of time to work on it and then have it submitted, but you might not. So depending on how quick you are with these, maybe kind of depends on how far you're going to get today in class. So the very top thing is definitions. Those are important. They're examples. It's pretty similar to the sheet we just worked through. There's the definition. Here's some examples type of thing. So I'm not going to spend, that's something I want you to kind of work through. I'm going to go through one example, a couple examples on the front, and then I'm going to let you get going. So it says for each of the following genotypes below, determine what the phenotypes would be. Okay, so when we talk about genotypes, we're talking about the letters. And for the phenotypes, we're talking about how they physically look. So these P's and purple only account for this first one, and then it's kind of looking at some different traits after that. So it says purple flowers are dominant to white flowers. So purple is dominant to white. So if purple is dominant to white, and if the genotype is big P, what do we see? The dominant recessive trait. Dominant, and what is the dominant trait? So we see purple. It's going to physically look purple. Big P, little p, do we see the dominant or recessive trait?
Dominant.
Because the dominant dominates over the recessive. So what do we see then? We see purple. Recessive, little p, what are we going to see? The dominant or recessive? Recessive, and what is the recessive phenotype?
White flower.
We're going to see a white flower. Yeah, now technically purple flower, white flower. I just wrote purple and white. hairy knuckles, bobtail, round seeds, cleft chin, no cleft chin. There's some different things we look at. Any questions about kind of what I'm asking you to do for that first one? All right. For number 2, for each of the following, write whether it's homozygous dominant. If it's homozygous dominant, we're going to write HD. If it's heterozygous, we're going to write HZ. And if it's homozygous recessive, we're going to write HR. So I'm just going to do this first row together. Big A, are those the same or different? And is that the dominant alleles or the recessive alleles? So that's going to be HD. It's homozygous dominant. Big F, little f, are those the same or different?
Different.
So that's going to be heterozygous, which is HZ. Okay, that's HZ. Big A, little a, same or different? Is that homo or hetero then? That's heterozygous, so HZ. Little g, same or different? Same, so that's homo. And do the littles represent dominant or recessive?
Recessive.
So that's going to be HR. Clarification on those. Okay, then from there it's kind of going through and giving some information, like you take a homozygous black female and you cross it with a homozygous recessive male, or a heterozygous female with a homozygous recessive male. Just so we're clear, in the very, very top, it talks about what the traits are. And this one is talking about dog fur. And black dog fur is dominant, big B, over the recessive alleles, little b for white fur. When you get to a different page, page number 3, it talks about fruit flies with red eyes that are dominant over white eyes, which are recessive, and we'd ask you to use letter E's. And then on the back, it talks about hereditary deafness in dogs as a recessive trait. Okay, so for each one, we kind of give you what the traits are, whether they're dominant or recessive. We also tell you what the alleles are to use. You could use any letter, but we're suggesting you use them. So we have about 11 minutes. I'm asking you to have pages 1 and 2 completed for tomorrow. By Thursday night, I'm asking for this whole thing to be done. So depending upon how quick you are, will kind of depend upon how far you get today. But if you have any questions on this stuff, please make sure you ask to get clarification so we can get those questions answered now. Because when are we testing? Next week, Thursday or Friday, and your class is the very first one on Thursday. So we're testing on this stuff on Thursday. Today we're talking about completely dominant traits. Tomorrow we'll start talking about some variations or some twists, some exceptions. Okay? So let me know what I can do to answer questions.